Hey guys, my name is RyanCentral and welcome to HitScan. What are the best Valorant settings for you? There's a lot of videos out there and all of them are really good, but I often feel that some of them focus on a lot of stuff outside of game, changing Windows administrative privileges, and going into some pretty deep and scary stuff if you're not really used to changing up your PC. So I wanted to get the word from the horse's mouth. So today I'm sitting down with the tech lead for VALORANT Nu, whose job is to literally focus on these kind of things, and he also has his own YouTube channel where he goes into a bit more detail. In this video we're going over the best settings, what you might want to change up to get the best performance, even the best visual experience, but also what stuff is worth leaving well alone or even just not worth touching at all. There is one setting I wanted to focus on first, that being Nvidia Reflex. Not only because it's so important when it comes to your performance and getting the most out of it, it also really connects nicely to the sponsor of this video, Alienware, and the Nvidia G-Sync monitors like I'm about to show you. This is the Alienware 25 360Hz monitor that I'm playing a bit of Valorant on. It has a 1 millisecond GTG response time as well as Nvidia G-Sync like a lot of these beastie Alienware monitors have. That relationship between a G-Sync monitor and Nvidia Reflex is really the thing that marries these two so well together when it comes to games like Valorant. For an idiot's guide to Nvidia Reflex, it's all about reducing that input time from you clicking the mouse to you seeing your action appear on the screen in front of you. Seems straightforward, but that mouse click has to go through your CPU, then your GPU, then to your display. Nvidia Reflex is trying to cut out as many middlemen as possible to maintain the quickest speed as you can. That's only a couple of milliseconds difference, but that is the difference with tech shooters like Valorant. If you have that reduction in latency and the enemy doesn't, that is an edge that you can use, and it's going to mean a lot in these kind of games where stress and those one-time shots really are an impact. You don't see a reduction in FPS or more stress put onto the CPU. It really is a net win when it comes to reducing latency. A lot of benchmarks have shown it, and here's a quick example of what it can be like in Valorant when you have all of these settings turned on and boosted. And it's really easy to set up in Valorant, just going to the settings, turning it on and boosting. So shout out to Nvidia for making some awesome tech, and also shout out to Alienware for having some amazing monitors to really highlight that. I'm still trash at Valorant, but I've got the best performance I can get with the help of these two.
It feels like Nvidia Reflex is really the helpful thing when it comes to that kind of performance. Is this something that everybody should be using if they have that option available to them? Is there any, not so much like negatives, but any downsides of where you might consider not having Nvidia Reflex turned on? Because really for me, it sounds like it's something that doesn't have a downfall, so to speak.
Yeah, Reflex is basically a free win. Without getting into all the details, sort of the way it works is the graphics driver in the game do some coordination to try and feed the GPU at the last responsible moment. So it helps the game do things like sample input closer to the point where the game is actually going to be sending the new scene over to the GPU for rendering, which will reduce the total latency.
And that's like you as the developers of like Valorant working with Nvidia to make that as good as possible, right? Like it's a married relationship in order to get the most out of that kind of thing. As far as I can tell.
Yeah, the game has to basically coordinate with the graphics driver, so there's a piece on both sides.
I guess before we actually go into some of the nitty-gritty areas new, I feel that there's already one thing in my settings that you'd point out if you saw it in anybody else playing the game, but are there any other like big mistakes that you see people using that maybe have more of an impact on performance than people might not expect?
For the most part, the game is going to do a pretty good job by default based on what your hardware is. I know you're referring to the display mode in this particular case. Right now, in the current patch, you get much better system latency in full screen rather than windowed full screen. We actually have some upcoming work. We tested it on PvE recently that should bring windowed full screen much closer to full screen on the latency angle. I want to separate out, like there's a difference between performance and system latency, right? When we're talking about performance, we're generally talking about like how many frames per second you're getting. System latency is really about how long does it take for your actions to be processed and to show up in game. And yeah, I think the number in patch 4.01 for dropping into windowed full screen was something like a 9.5 millisecond increase. Whereas on my computer, turning all of your settings from low to high was only like a 1.3 millisecond increase. So, about 6 times. That will vary a little bit based on your hardware. But it's a really big hit until we get that improvement in there to bring windowed full screen more in line with full screen.
Before we actually get into the graphics quality, are there any other things that you suppose in game that would have an impact on performance or latency before you even get to graphics quality, other than I guess like display mode, but like the aspect ratio? Obviously you want all of this turned off, or do you want it turned on and have it at your refresh rate that you usually play at? What's the best way for maybe those that don't have like the top end spec PCs as an example?
So the aspect ratio method should be completely irrelevant as far as performance and latency go. FPS limiter is kind of like a matter of preference. It's going to depend on your hardware and also just kind of on whether you can accept a variable frame rate. If you're playing on kind of a low-end machine where maybe it can't quite keep up even at 60 FPS, I have heard players say sometimes they like to lower it to something that they can keep stable. If you're on a higher-end machine pushing 240, 300 FPS, generally a little bit of variance there isn't quite as painful. But really, that's kind of a personal preference. I typically leave mine capped at like 240 or 300 FPS.
Basically the same as your monitor refresh rate, I guess. And that's seemingly like for Valorant a better option than using VSync, for example, or any other system that checks the game's frame rate to the refresh rate of your monitor.
Yeah, I don't use VSync. I also don't use an external frame rate limiter. I have in previous games had issues where I've wanted to limit my frame rate, and there are a bunch of tools out there that do it, but it's generally better if it's in the game, in the engine.
So this has been just tampered with in the typical way that I think people, when they want to get performance, if they're playing on a toaster or if they're playing on the next big PC, everybody's going to turn everything down because that's kind of what a lot of the pros do to just make sure that they get consistent performance, right? What are things that you can turn up that don't really have an impact on frame rate, performance, and also latency? What can people actually enjoy when it comes to some of the high quality stuff that doesn't actually tank even a pretty low benchmarked PC?
Right. So really you're trying to balance a few different goals here. You want to make the game look as good as it can. You want it to run at the highest frame rate possible, and you want to have the lowest system latency possible. And sometimes those goals are aligned and sometimes they're in conflict. If you're running on a really low-end piece of hardware, I think the minimum spec for Valorant is a laptop from 2012 with integrated graphics. Those machines tend to be bound on overall graphics performance. And in that case, turning down everything to low is going to improve your experience, because the more work that we have to do on the graphics side, like the worse your performance is going to be. If you're on more recent hardware, think like a GPU, probably in the last like 3 to 5 years, you're probably getting closer to a situation where the thing that is slowest in the game is going to be running the game simulation on your CPU. And in that case, for performance, you don't really have to worry too much about graphics settings. You can turn basically everything up and the GPU will do a little bit work, and you're probably not going to see a big FPS hit. There are a few settings that do impact CPU performance a little bit, detail quality being the main one. So you might see a tiny win by adjusting detail quality. But if you're running on like a 2070 or a 3080 or something like that, turning down material quality, turning down UI quality, turning down any of the rest of the things in this menu are probably not going to give you an increase in FPS in real gameplay. You might see an improvement standing around in the range by yourself, but once you're in a game with actually 10 players, combat happening, abilities firing, probably the CPU is going to be the thing that is slower rather than graphics.
Okay, so really it's just detail quality that is having the most like adverse impact on performance out of all of these settings. So this one is the one that you want to kind of like make sure is low, but everything else you can up it and not impact performance, so to speak.
That's right. And even with detail quality, like I would play with it and test it on your own hardware. Like the impact is probably pretty small, but that is one that can have an impact. The other thing I'll say is like, this is constantly changing as we make improvements to the game. So any advice that we give here, just kind of like recognize that it's a bit ephemeral in nature, and 6 months from now, it might be different.
Speaking of which, this was an option at the top multi-thread rendering that came in somewhat recently, like within the past year for sure. is this something that people want to be turning on? Is it kind of like Nvidia Reflex, where if you have the option, you want to be enabling it, or is there some downsides to activating it, either not having an impact in the right areas or...
Yeah, so multi-threaded rendering has been around for about a year. There are no downsides to turning it on. We only make the option available if you have a certain number of CPU cores and if you have a certain tier of GPU. Basically, what it does is it takes all the rendering work that the game has to do on the CPU and it spreads it across 2 cores rather than just using 1 core. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but at this point, it's well tested. There should be no visual differences, and it should only be a performance win.
Kind of like Nvidia Reflex, where if you have it, you want to be using it, no matter kind of what PC you're running, I suppose, other than the examples that you gave.
Right.
The one thing that I always tend to do is turn off all of these at the bottom, like you just naturally just shift to the right and go for everything. Mm-hmm. You've got like experimental sharpening and distortion, casting shadows. Are there any of these that you might want to turn on instead? I know, for example, with cast shadows and distortion, you've spoke about it in your video, and some of these definitely come down to just personal preference. But are there any that people might want to experiment more with because they have that leeway to do that? Or are there some that, if you're on and want to get the most out of your PC when it comes to like frame rate performance and latency, that you almost always want turning off?
Right. So again, right, like it kind of comes down to what level of hardware you're on. If you're on really old hardware, turning it off is going to help you. If you're on newer hardware, turning it off won't. And it really just kind of comes down to like, what is your visual preference, right? So I like experimental sharpening a lot. I like bloom a lot. I'm not a huge fan of the visual effects of distortion and cast shadows, so I tend to turn those off. One thing you can do if you're on an Nvidia GPU is we've got graphs for, I think it's called render latency in the stats menu. And so one thing you can do is you can turn that on and see how settings impact your render latency. And that won't be a full view of your entire system latency because that's only kind of what's visible to the game and to the graphics hardware. So it won't cover like the latency from your monitor or from your mouse. But that is one tool you can use to sort of see what the impact to latency might be in addition to what the impact to FPS might be.
Cool. And I guess another thing too is these options being dropped down. What kind of impact do you see turning them up? Is this purely something that people, again, want to be putting down to low or sort of having midway? Because having it to low is either diminishing returns again or just something that is not really worth doing in a tack shooter where your eyes need to be as clear seeing as possible, right?
Right. We try and avoid having the settings give you a competitive advantage. We sometimes have a miss there, and in those cases, that's generally a bug that we will go and fix. But in general, so like anti-aliasing is going to reduce jagged edges as you kind of move around the world and look at some of the angles, right? So for me, I like having those smoothed out, and I use MSAA 4X. I know some players absolutely hate having any of that smoothing and just turn it off entirely. So, that is a personal preference type thing if your hardware is good enough to run it. Anisotropic filtering, I typically put on 8X, and I often pair that with material quality high. Having material quality, texture quality, and anisotropic filtering turned up to 8X will make your gun skins look as good as possible. When you start turning down those settings, sometimes they look a little muddy or just not quite as fancy.
I think one of the areas, because I feel like the stats in Valorant are quite easy to understand. I think more than anything, people just gravitate to what like Hiko and Tens are doing, and it's usually just turning everything down and doing some other third-party stuff with like the control panel of Nvidia, which we'll touch on in a second. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's something that people shouldn't be doing necessarily, or more that they don't have to, right? That when you have these pro players that are on very expensive PCs and turning everything to down, somebody that's not got the same kind of power behind them as Tens, Hiko, or whoever is likely to do the same. So do you think that there's some element of like leeway that people can up certain qualities without feeling like they're going to start to bottom frag in games because they're not as responsive or they're worried about performance issues cropping up now and again?
Right. Like the advice I would give is just always test on your personal hardware. I think for most machines in the last 5 years, you can turn most of this stuff up without seeing any noticeable impact. I know there are some players that really like turning everything down all the way because they just, want the world to be as simple as possible. I suspect
Peace of mind as well.
I suspect if you went to some of those pros and said, "Hey, we're just going to give you the entire level as a gray box," they'd be like, "Great, right? I don't care about anything except that." But for most of us, I like to make the game look as good as it possibly can while still running great.
So what would be your ideal settings then? It's hard because everybody's PC is different, but you have a good gauge of kind of where people are roughly aligned at the moment with their graphics cards or whatever. What is the most optimized, I suppose, when it comes to performance, but also looking as good as possible?
Well, I can tell you what my personal preference is, but it's mostly the visuals that I like. Is that something you're interested in? So what I do on my PC is I do multi-threaded rendering on, I do material quality high, texture quality high, detail quality low, UI quality low, vignette on, anti-aliasing 4x, anisotropic filtering 8x, clarity off, sharpening on, bloom on, distortion off, shadows off. But that is just because that is that makes the game look the way that I like it the most. It's not so much about the performance. My PC can run everything on high without seeing a noticeable degradation.
Sure. So let's say if somebody looks at this, they screenshot it and put it into their own game. First question would be, it sounds like going into the practice range to see if it works for you is not a good shout, because like you said, going into a game where there's more abilities and more stuff going on, what is the best way to check to see if these settings are good for your PC? I imagine going into ranked is a terrible idea if you've got to adjust it as you go along, but would you just say unrated, deathmatch? Would you prefer to be in something like Spike Rush where abilities are being used, where obviously in deathmatch they're not? What's a good place to really test out your settings?
Yeah, so you want something representative, and for most of us, that's going to be the 10-player unrated or compat experience. If you're a Spike Rush main, then by all means go and optimize for Spike Rush. But typically, what I do actually is I will set up settings that I want to test. I will turn on the graphs. I will record, and I will play the game as normal, and then I'll look back over my tape and see what the graphs did. So, if I run a full game with everything on low, and then I run another full game with everything on high, and I'm looking at my latency and my FPS graphs, I can kind of get a representative idea of what the impact would be.
For sure. And then I guess, let's say, for example, a person watching this video does that. They like the settings, they look really good, but their performance is just eking a little bit. What do you think are the settings that people should adjust first?
Maybe I can invert that question a little bit and answer kind of the thing that I think makes the game look the most different is probably material quality and anisotropic filtering. So those are the things that I would turn down last, because I think those give you kind of the biggest bang for the buck in terms of making the game look great. Bloom is also pretty significant, especially if you're a Sova main. I think his bow looks pretty flat if you turn Bloom off. But those would be the ones I would kind of focus on first to see if you're capable of running with them on and still having a great experience.
I remember watching a Tens video as well a while ago where he was talking about settings that he went through 5 or 6 different things before he even got into Valorant, running it on administrator mode, making sure that some settings in Windows were turned off, such as make power performance was the best it can be. Are there any other things before you even launch Valorant that are worth checking if they're on or off? Or is that again pros wanting to make sure that they have the perfect performance, that it's not necessary to do that? Is there anything in game that you really want to make sure is on or off before you even get involved in the Valorant settings?
So there are a few things I do, but for the most part, Windows is also configured out of the box pretty well. I do tend to set my power plan to high performance for gaming. I think that's most relevant if you're on a laptop with a battery. Sometimes I think you might see the CPU run a little bit slower depending on your configuration. So I do typically turn that on. You absolutely should not run the game as administrator. That will not give you any better performance, and that just gives the game more permissions than it needs to have on your PC. You should avoid anything involving Windows compatibility settings. I've seen some players start messing with settings that are really for making old software work on newer versions of Windows. that will not help performance and will often lead to weird bugs because, that's not the common case that modern game developers are testing for. I've seen some folks talk about tools messing with like cached memory or with process affinity or making changes to the registry. There should be no need for players to do any of that. It's not going to help your performance. It's generally going to be snake oil.
From one of the things that you said to me beforehand is even before you get into some of the 3D settings in like control panel, obviously it's going to be different for AMD users, but you said that even aspects of this are almost irrelevant because the game takes care of that for you, that a lot of these settings no, because once you go into Valorant, it's a different story.
Right. The caveat I will put on that is if you do change things here, this typically applies at like the graphics driver level and will override what you set in the game. So I have seen some players report like, hey, like I set an isotropic filtering to 8x, but my gun skins look bad. And then, we look at their machine and it turns out they had overridden it to something really low in the control panel. So I would be cognizant of that anything you set here will probably override what the game is trying to do. But typically we try and expose everything that would matter within the game.
Yeah, for example, if you have VSync in here enabled, but not in the game, it will probably still have VSync enabled, right?
It will probably VSync, yeah, exactly.
Are there any things in here that are worth changing? Speaking of which, I might actually have VSync on this at this point, so that's a good thing to double check and turn on.
Use the 3D application setting. I think generally means I will follow what the game sets, so either should be
so
fine,
if in doubt, just set it as that, and then once you get into Valorant, it'll take care of it for you.
Right. I do typically set, I believe there's like a prefer maximum performance versus balanced power here. Maybe it's that power management mode. I am actually not sure if this is necessary anymore. But I have years of habit of setting that, and that just causes the GPU to keep its clock rates higher, I believe. I think in the game, if you set reflex to on plus boost, it might do the same thing without setting this, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yeah, if in doubt, might as well turn it on. Are there any other things in here that you think are worth double checking? Or at the very least, like if it's not about optimizing your PC, people might have seen this for the first time and are curious, like are there any settings that they want to keep an eye on that they don't have turned on, or they want to make sure are on?
I typically leave everything else on the defaults. There is a setting in here that I get asked about a lot, which is the low latency mode. That is a precursor to reflex, and for games that have reflex takes over and supersedes low latency mode, so you don't need to mess with it. There's no harm if you turn it on, but it will basically do nothing.
Yeah, don't expect this to start you top fragging and climbing out of silver.
Right, exactly.
Especially if you have
reflex on.
Is there any difference between having reflex on and then plus boost, or is it just again an extra bit of a boost, right?
So reflex on mostly helps in situations where you are GPU bound. Reflex on plus boost adds some additional optimizations for when you are CPU bound in rendering scenarios. On some GPUs, I think it also does some power stuff similar to this prefer max performance setting. So I typically turn it to on plus boost. As far as I know, there's no downside. But again, test on your hardware, see what you think.
You sort of mentioned like snake oil before, and I think it's more just habits that people have, especially those that played in other games beforehand and then moved to Valorant, and they just go through the same workflow of making sure that everything's good. What I suppose are the main things to keep an eye out for when it comes to red flags and changes to your system? You already highlighted like actually adjusting stuff within Windows compatibility and the like. Are there any other areas that people might hear about helping performance, when in actuality it either doesn't do anything or it's actually more detrimental to your PC to mess with it in any capacity?
Right. Generally, anything that is, messing with compatibility settings, messing with administrator mode, like changing obscure knobs with a third-party application that like purportedly does something to make Windows run better. Proceed with caution, right? Like if you're not 100% confident in testing exactly what it does and getting the benefit you expect, it probably is setting a landmine that you might trip on later. We have seen some very weird bugs from obscure Windows settings being flipped in a way that we didn't anticipate.
I guess for those in the future that are looking towards like the next Christmas or the next birthday and they want to upgrade their PC for Valorant, what's more important, the CPU or the GPU that people should be looking to maybe up on average? Because you guys have a good understanding of like what more common like graphics cards people have or CPUs and combinations of the two. What do you think is worth upgrading first for those that are looking at it?
So it depends what you're running on. If you're on one of those the super old laptops, like just moving to something with a dedicated GPU is probably going to do better. If you have a graphics card that is, less than 5 years old, probably you're going to get more bang for the buck out of upgrading the CPU. Valorant is heavily optimized for low end GPUs. So like, we're never going to make a 3090 sweat. The main advice I'd give to players is just always test, right? Like, don't flip a knob randomly. Like make sure that you're getting the benefit that you expect. And I'll also just say, like, we're always working on performance. We have some stuff in the pipe that I hope will make performance better, and like it's a priority for us. We want the game to run great across all these different pieces of hardware, and I hope y'all are having fun and having lots of FPS.
I guess a lot of people can be really knee-jerky as well when it comes to performance. Like if they have one blip where they think that everything's gone wrong and then start reverting stuff or adjusting it. I guess like the advice of what you gave about testing stuff over a 40-minute game, for example, and having the graph enabled really allows you to see overall how it's doing and not over focus on certain moments in certain areas where, again, like the PC just maybe has a blip and drops a frame now and again.
Certainly. I will say, though, I do try and in all of my performance testing, I want to look at what my worst case is, which is typically going to be a big team fight executing onto a site. So if you can find a moment where you have 10 players alive, all engaged in combat, like that is a really good stress test for what is my worst possible performance. And typically in those scenarios, graphics quality settings aren't the thing that's going to make the difference.
Now, for those that are more interested in what the settings specifically do, and also like examples of benchmarking for input latency and performance, you actually have stuff on your own channel where you're going into a huge amount of detail on them. So where can people find you, and what can they maybe expect in the future on your channel? What else are you going to talk about?
As for future things in the channel, I don't know. But if you want to follow me, Twitter's probably the best place. I'm active there. I'm Riot Nu on Twitter. I'm also on YouTube, as you mentioned. Right now, we've only got like 2 Valorant videos there, but maybe we'll do more in the future.
And that's it for this time. Thank you very much for watching. You can check out all of Nu's details in the description below. I definitely recommend watching his videos if you're more interested in what each of the different settings do and how they might have an impact on your performance.